It is my great privilege to be able to be here this evening. It is a great privilege anytime to be able to preach the gospel. It is a great privilege to be able to meet brethren that I have not met before. And it is especially neat today to be able to see some brethren which I haven't seen in decades. Our first work after we graduated from the Memphis School of Preaching was at the West Side congregation in Sheffield, and it's great to see some of those old friends from that period. Great to spend some time with the Lone Criers, with the Boltons, and I appreciate very much Brother Holt coming up and introducing himself. Unfortunately, 30 years nearly has caused some of those memories not to be as strong as they were, but I'm blessed to be able to rekindle some of these friendships and relationships. It's great to see so many others who are familiar faces, either connected with the school or otherwise. But so great to be able to be a part of this inaugural lectureship. I've been impressed by the lessons which I've heard today, and I'm blessed to have been able to hear them. I'm looking forward to being able to go through the book and to hear some of the lessons on CD and so forth as well. I appreciate the hard work that Brother Crosswhite has done in putting all of this together. Just absolutely excellent. And I don't believe that Brother Crosswhite and I had ever met before, but I'm so impressed by his kindness and his obvious work ethic. Appreciate him very much, and appreciate this congregation for hosting this lectureship. The text of the lectureship is Psalm 48:13. Mark ye well her bulwarks, consider her palaces, that ye may tell it to the generation following. That text emphasizes Zion, but it fits the need to defend and to preach spiritual Zion. And the particular books which are the concern of these lessons this weekend are Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. And these books showed the bulwarks of God's people, both in and outside of Zion, through a very pivotal point in history, which followed the conquering of Babylon by Medo-Persia, or as we'll refer to it through the course of this lesson simply as Persia. Our focus this evening is on the character of Esther. Now, when we read through the book, we do see the character of Esther shown, but as I was studying and trying to decide exactly how I would approach the lesson, and had the privilege to do the exegesis on Esther chapters 1 and 2, I couldn't help but note that Esther is not the only person who is brought out in such a way that you see her character. You see others' characters as well. And so I took some liberty, and I appreciate some kind words Brother Crosswhite wrote in the front of the book which he gave to me, and considered some of the others in the book as well. So we're going to be dealing with some of that this evening. As far as the book itself, Esther is a curious book in the context of Scripture because it's a book named for a woman. Of course, we can think about Ruth, but usually when we're looking through the books of the Bible, they're named for men or for something regarding the subject of the book. This book is curious in that it concerns a power which is foreign to us, both in space and in time. Now, if we've been watching the news over the last several days, we have seen a lot of political maps, or maps demonstrating some of the political things which are taking place. And that's the general region. Just if those maps would scroll down a little bit further, and you could see the southern part of the Black Sea and toward the Persian Gulf, you'd have the area of these books. as they are dealing largely with Persia and with Judea, as Nehemiah and Ezra would return from Persia to Judea, and as Esther took place in Persia, just above the Persian Gulf. But these places are foreign to us as we view this from the United States and from an existence which usually is rather ethnocentric. Also foreign to us in time, because we're going back in history about 1,400 years, 1,500 years, and so that's a little bit odd. 1,500, 2,500 years, and that's a little bit odd for us as well. It's a curious book because it deals with a foreign monarch. In fact, this monarch is sort of interesting in the sense that we don't call him by his Persian name, even though he was a Persian monarch. We mention in the exegesis portion of the book that he actually has 4 different names. One of them is the name which we have in the King James, and that is Ahasuerus. Another is the name that the Greeks would know him by, that is Xerxes. But he also had 2 other names, Ahasuerus and Kershyarsha. And we wouldn't even think of those names under most conditions because this is so foreign to us. This book concerns foreign customs, including something called Purim, because we read in this book concerning the casting of lots. The word for a lot would be pur, so the Purim would be lots. The Feast of Purim had to do then with the casting of lots, something which is seen in this book. It's also an interesting book because it does not contain the name of the author of the book. And by that I don't mean who actually put pen to paper. What I mean is it doesn't contain the name of God. And yet, as we are reading through this book, it is hard to remove it from a context which has God at its very center. God is really seen throughout the book working providentially, even if He is not named. For many people, this is a favorite book. And for many, especially women, Esther is a favorite Bible person, or to use the term accommodatively, a favorite Bible character. Why is she such a favorite Bible character? Well, number one, she's a woman, and so women obviously tend to gravitate toward her as a favorite because of that. But she was also young and beautiful. She was a queen. She was courageous. She was a savior of her people. And she was and has been celebrated for millennia. What we want to consider this evening is we want to consider a very brief overview of the events of the book. It may be that there's some here this evening who aren't familiar with the book of Esther, and so a brief overview will help to put all of this in its proper context. And then we want to consider those contrasts in character that we mentioned, and we're going to really focus upon 3 attributes of Esther herself. We go back to the late 480s BC, so the very beginning of the 5th century BC, and Persia's king Ahasuerus, or Xerxes, had deposed of his king Vashti because she would not be paraded before the king's drunken court, Esther chapter 1. When Ahasuerus remembered Vashti, he began the process to replace her, ultimately choosing a Jewish. He did not know she was Jewish at a time. Her ethnicity was undisclosed to the Persians, but a Jewish maiden named Esther to be the queen. Esther 2, verses 1 through 20. Shortly after Esther's becoming queen, her cousin Mordecai, who was in the gate, which means that he had a position of some authority in Shushan. Shushan is a biblical name for a location in Persia called Susa, fact, in Scripture it's called Shushan the palace. Mordecai discovered a plot against this king Ahasuerus and let Esther know, and Esther made it known to the king. The king ultimately executed the conspirators. Esther 2, verses 21 through 23. Mordecai had saved the king, but he had not been rewarded. That will come back into the study in just a few minutes. But about 5 years later, I think Esther 4:7 gives us that idea, he would endanger himself because he offended a fellow named Haman. This Haman had been elevated by Ahasuerus, but Mordecai did not bow down to Haman. And Haman's anger was so great that he determined not just to punish Mordecai, but to exterminate all of the Jews in Persia. Esther 3, verses 1 through 6. Now, he determined when he would do it, and he actually determined that using the the lot. Having determined when he was going to destroy the Jews, it was left to Haman to convince Ahasuerus that the Jews were a disobedient people who ought to be killed. And he was able to do that. So Ahasuerus issued an irreversible decree, which effectively sealed the fate of all the Jews. Esther 3, 7 through 15. Now someone might say, irreversible. Well, perhaps you've heard the expression, the law of the Medes and the Persians. When the Medes and Persians had a law, that law was unalterable. It could not be changed. So once Ahasuerus has said the Jews can be exterminated by the Persians, they are dead. It is as good as done. He cannot say, I think I'll change my mind. I feel like issuing some grace, so I'm going to rescind that law. No, that's the law. That's the law. They are to be destroyed. Esther, who lived in the palace, did not know about Haman and Ahasuerus' plan, but Mordecai did. Mordecai knew of the threat, and he and the Jews throughout the land of Persia mourned. And certainly they would have been praying as they were mourning. But he sent word to Esther of what was taking place, and he urged her to speak to Ahasuerus on the Jews' behalf. Esther 4, verses 1 through 9. Someone might say, well, that's easy enough. She's the queen. She could just go to the king any time that she wanted. But that's not the way that the Persian court worked. Even though she was the queen, she did not have just carte blanche to go into the king's chamber, into the throne room. In fact, she could be, and she knew that she could be, put to death if she approached the king not having been bidden by him. But she was convinced by Mordecai that her people needed her. In fact, he encouraged her, suggesting that providence may have put her into that position. She was there in that kingdom, perhaps, for such a time as this. And so she determined that she would approach the king, and she was even willing to die if it were necessary to try to save her people. Esther 4, verses 10 through 17. After she, and for that matter, all of these Jews had fasted for 3 days, she approached the king, who received her, extended his scepter to her, and offered her what she might desire. In fact, he's going to say up to half of the kingdom. Her desire was to host a banquet for Ahasuerus and for Haman alone, and then a second banquet like that first, Esther chapter 5, verses 1 through 8. Between these two banquets, Haman's pride was exhibited in his expressing his glory to his wife and his friends. And we see also his indignation when he saw that Mordecai, who had offended him, was still in the gate, still in this position of authority, and was still disrespecting Haman. Esther 5, verses 9 through 14. At the suggestion of his wife and his friends, Haman built a gallows 75 feet tall, especially for the execution of the hated Mordecai. Esther 5:14. All he needed was Ahasuerus' approval of the vengeful plan. Esther 6, verse 4. On the night before Haman was to speak to Ahasuerus, Ahasuerus was unable to sleep. And so he decided to go back and to read his court records, which are called his chronicles. So when we think about the books that we have in our Old Testament, we have 1st and 2nd Kings, then we have 1st and 2nd Chronicles, and 1st and 2nd Chronicles sound a lot like 1st and 2nd Kings. The reason we have those two types of records is the Chronicles would be the official records of a particular nation. And so he goes and he reads the Chronicles of the Persians, and he is reminded about his being protected when this attempt on his life was going to be made by Mordecai, who had sent message through Esther that these were going to take his life. And he realized that this one who had discovered the plot never had been rewarded. Esther chapter 6, verses 1 through 4. When Haman approached the king, Ahasuerus spoke first. Haman probably was wishing he could speak first because he had this grand plan to eliminate Mordecai. But Ahasuerus spoke first. Now, pridefully, remember we spoke about Haman's pride earlier being exhibited when he expressed his glory to his wife and his friends. So his pride is a pretty common attribute that he has. He thought that this honor that Ahasuerus was talking about was for himself. And so he desired a lavish reward, Esther 6, verses 5 through 9. But surely to his astonishment and surely to his disappointment, he was told that that award wasn't for Haman, it was for Mordecai. Well, Haman did carry out this reward, Esther 6, verses 10 and 11. But he also returned home distraught. And he was cautioned by his wife and his advisors that he would fail to accomplish the purpose that he had imagined against Mordecai and the Jews, but had sealed rather his own fate. And it's about that time he received that proverbial knock on the door to go to the second feast, Exodus 6, verses 12 through 14. At the second banquet, when Esther was asked again what she desired, she revealed that her people, the Jews, had been threatened with destruction, and that Haman was the one who was responsible. Well, that very night, Haman was hung upon his own gallows, which he had prepared for his enemy, Mordecai, Esther 7. And Haman's house was given to Esther, and Mordecai, not Haman, was advanced, Esther 8, verses 1 and 2. Esther desired, though, more than the death of Haman, and more than the house of Haman, and more even than the elevation of Mordecai, that the Jews might be able to have safety. Now, while the decree to destroy the Jews could not be made void, and it could not even be altered, what Ahasuerus determined to do was to make a new, equally unalterable decree, which would allow the Jews to be able to defend themselves against the Persians who were going to be attacking. Esther 8, verses 3 through 14. When the Jews received this word, they had great joy, and their adversaries had great fear. Esther 8, verses 15 through 17. So when that original decree, the one of Ahasuerus at Haman's desire, was carried out, so was the second, the one at Esther's desire. And so throughout Persia, the Jews fought back and destroyed nearly 80,000 of Ahasuerus' people who came out to destroy them. That number included Haman's 10 sons, Esther 9, 1 through 16. The saving of the Jews in Persia was followed by great feasting, which would endure in a feast called Purim, Esther 9, verses 17 through 32. And then finally, Mordecai was elevated to second in the kingdom of Persia, and the Jews in Persia had a lasting peace there, Esther 10, verses 1 through 3. All right, that's a very quick overview of the book of Esther, but we've seen in there a number of names, a number of people repeated over and over. The book of Esther is a book of characters, and it's a book of contrasts. There are many individuals who are named in addition to those whom we named. We don't have time, we're not going to concern ourselves with looking at those characters in particular, but we could think of ones like Memucan, who was the concerned advisor, Haggai, who was the beneficent eunuch, Hathach, who was the faithful messenger, Zeresh, who was the cold-hearted wife. We want to focus on the five whose names we really noticed. Ahasuerus, the humbled king, Vashti, the modest queen, Mordecai, the motivating cousin, Esther, the valiant queen, and Haman, the arrogant courtier. We're not necessarily going to do that in that order because we're going to want to focus at the end on Esther. But these are the five we want to consider. Let's begin with Ahasuerus. Ahasuerus, King Xerxes. We described him as the humbled king. We went into more of this detail in the book than we're necessarily going to cover now, and you might glance again if you have the opportunity at some point at the exegesis that's in the book. But this king Ahasuerus had great pride and great anger. And that's sort of exhibited in Esther chapter 1. But he also ultimately was a person who, even though he was powerful and capable, had a capacity to be tender-hearted. And that's represented in Esther chapters 2 through 10. We see a marked contrast between the Ahasuerus of chapter 1 and the Ahasuerus of chapters 2 and following. So what happened? Well, between Esther 1:3 and Esther 2:16, there's a period of about 5 years that passes. During this time, according to the text, he's going to be looking for a queen to replace Vashti, whom he has deposed. But if we look in our history books, we learn that something else is taking place during this time, and it's especially interesting to read this in the histories of Herodotus. Herodotus doesn't bring in Esther in this time period that's spoken of in Scripture, using it as a benchmark, but we can hold the two records together and we can see that we're talking about the same time. But Ahasuerus determined that he was going to fight against the western regions of Persia. Along the Aegean Sea, you had an area called Ionia, and the Greeks and Persians would fight over this area. But Xerxes, or Ahasuerus, was going to do more than that. He was going to take the battle to Greece. And so he marched to western Asia Minor, what's modern-day Asia Minor, and then went north toward an area called the Hellespont. Now again, if you've been watching the news and you've seen the maps that have been on the news of where Ukraine is, if you were to look, and I'm going to go from your perspective here, if you were to look at Ukraine, the sea here is the Black Sea. Due south of the western shore of the Black Sea, there's a little area of water, body of water, The Hellespont's about a mile wide, gets into the Propontis where it's a little bit wider. This is the area where Istanbul is today, that area where the Propontis runs into the Black Sea. But that little area about a mile wide, when Xerxes or Ahasuerus was on this campaign to go fight against Greece and their mainland, he tried to cross that, had a rope bridge built. As that rope bridge was being built, the Hellespont began to become very choppy. A storm developed, and that bridge, I said rope bridge, pontoon bridge, was torn up. See, I'm crossing on a rope bridge. That's pretty good. Anyway, the bridge was torn up by the storm. What he did was he had everybody that built that first bridge put to death, and then he had the Hellespont whipped. There were some shackles that were handcuffs, shackles that were thrown into the Hellespont. And as the people were beating the Hellespont, they cried out, "You are no God, you briny little stream. Nobody worships you." Well, he was a despot. He was a power-hungry madman who was frustrated by a body of water. All right, ultimately, they were able to cross. They had the bridge built. They marched through Thrace and then through Macedonia, Thessaly, heading down into Greece. A little side note there is when we're reading the book of Daniel, we see the ram and the he-goat, and the he-goat is moved with collar and jumps against the ram. The reason that happens is because the ram had marched through the he-goat on the way to Greece and had angered the he-goat. Collar moved with anger. And so Alexander the Great fulfills that prophecy, moving back against Persia. But anyway, he gets down into Greece, and as he's getting into Greece, really going through Thessaly, he comes to an area called the Hot Gates, popularly known as Thermopylae, and he's held off for 3 days by the 300 Spartans. And actually, there's several thousand people there, depending on what time of that battle you're looking at. But he's really humbled there at Thermopylae. And then he goes further down, and he loses battles at Salamis in 480 BC, at Mount Mikael and Plataea in 479 BC, and he basically goes home with his tail between his legs. That's why we have the contrast between Ahasuerus in chapter 1 and Ahasuerus in chapters 2 and following. He's been humbled by his Grecian campaign. In Esther 1:15, Esther 1:19, we see that it pleases Ahasuerus to go ahead and depose this queen who's disappointed him. Greek campaign. Esther chapter 2, verses 17 and 18. He has a great feast for this new queen. Somebody could say, well, that's just because we don't read about other feasts that he had for Vashti and so forth. He probably was just as nice to her and just as peaceful and humble before all of this took place. But I would disagree with that. Number one, when we see that feast in Esther chapter 1, that's not for Vashti. That's for Ahasuerus. But when we see the feast for Esther in chapter 2, that's for Esther. When we see that feast in Esther chapter 1, number 2, that's because of his greatness. She's just an object. Vashti is. That demonstrates his greatness. But then when we see the feast in Esther chapter 2, that is indeed Esther's feast. It's about her and about her greatness. When we get into Exodus chapter 5, verses 2 and 3, Esther 7:2, Esther 8:4, Esther 10:3, we see that not only is he ultimately willing to extend that scepter to somebody that hasn't been bidden, even after, in one case, he hadn't seen her for a month, hadn't called her into his chambers for a month. He extends that scepter. but he's also ultimately willing to elevate a Jew to the position of great authority that he does, second. And more than that, he's even willing to let the Jews kill his own people. All right, that's a changed man between Esther 1 and Esther 2. Let's go to the second of these characters, and that is Vashti. Vashti, we called her the modest queen. Well, before we do that, let me just give some key words here for Ahasuerus. He started out despotic, then he was humbled, and then he became tender-hearted. So there's the character of Ahasuerus in the book. Vashti was the modest queen, and what a great example of modesty. Probably some in this number, especially some of the ladies, have probably taught regarding the modesty of Vashti. She was fair. She was beautiful. But I would suggest that while she was beautiful on the outside, she was more beautiful even in her modesty, more beautiful on the inside. Ahasuerus ordered his servants to bring her forth and effectively to have her be observed by all of these princes from all over the various satrapies of his empire. She refused in Esther chapter 1, verses 11 and 12. Now, a side note, one might say, what if she hadn't refused? What if she had been willing to appear before these? Well, if that had been the case, then she would not have been deposed, Esther would not have become queen, and the Jews would have been destroyed in Persia. So perhaps providence led her to even determine that she was going to have the strength to withstand what he desired. Now, even if it hadn't, providentially, either the Lord would have intervened in another way, or God would have determined just to let the people who were in Judea suffice for the Jews. But regardless, she contributed to the salvation of the Jews in Persia. The key word for her character is not just beautiful, but beautifully modest. And that leads us to our third character that we would consider, and that is Mordecai. We associated with Mordecai the expression, the motivating cousin. We hear the expression, behind every good man there is a good woman. This is actually reversed. Behind this good woman, Esther, there was a good man, Mordecai. When we read about Mordecai first, it's in Esther 2:7. He brought up Hadassah. Hadassah, interestingly, is her Jewish name. Esther is her Persian name. And that sort of violates what we normally see. We think about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. That's what we popularly know them as, but God recognized them as Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah by their Jewish names, probably more so than their Babylonian names. Daniel, if I were to ask what his Babylonian name is, a lot of us probably wouldn't even know he had a Babylonian name. It's because we're taught his Hebrew name. His Babylonian name was Belteshazzar. And yet we don't learn, other than just one brief note, that Esther had a Jewish name, and that was Hadassah. But we call her Esther. But anyway, so he brought up Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, so his cousin, for she had neither father nor mother. She was an orphan. And the maid was fair and beautiful, whom Mordecai, when her father and mother were dead, took for his own daughter. He wasn't rearing a grandchild. He wasn't rearing a niece. He was rearing a cousin, and did so very admirably. Mordecai's motivation through the book is seen in that he ultimately desires, even from the outset, the salvation of the Jews. And so he told Esther, don't reveal who you are. Don't reveal what your background is, your ethnicity. Esther chapter 2:7. And chapter 2, verse 10, 2:7 is where we first are introduced to him. And then he also reveals that he loves Esther in that he wants to go and make sure that she's okay, check on her. So Esther chapter 2:11, every day He walked before the court of the women's house because he wanted to know how Esther was doing and what was going to become of her. This is when she was striving to become the next queen. So he had love and he had wisdom. And that combination of love and wisdom in Mordecai ultimately contributed to the salvation of the Jews. Esther 4, verses 13 and 14. So we associate those two words with his character, love and wisdom. That takes us to the fourth of these people, and that is Haman. Haman we would call the arrogant courtier. We've already talked a lot about Haman, so we won't belabor the point too much, but we saw that pride and we saw that anger. Now we saw pride and anger with Ahasuerus as well, but Ahasuerus was able to be humbled. Haman is not able to be humbled. He had pride and anger with stubbornness. And that resulted not in his being able to retain a kingdom the way that Xerxes did. That resulted in his death. Esther 3, verses 1 and 2, we first get an idea of how prideful and stubborn and angry and so forth he is. We see his hatred of Mordecai introduced in Esther chapter 3, verses 5 through 6. But his own ego, not being stroked by one man, caused him to want to destroy a whole nation. He has serious character flaws. He was proud and angry and stubborn. And we see that especially when we look at Esther 6, verses 6 through 12. But that takes us to where we'll spend the next 45 minutes. No, just kidding. That clock is that clock is moving entirely too quickly. That takes us to Esther. And Esther, I believe we rightly would call the valiant queen. Now, when we hear the word valiant, we think, well, she was courageous. But I would suggest that valiant includes not only courage, but it includes other characters which are combined in a person with that courage. And she certainly has some other characteristics as well. For Esther, it was her courage and her beauty and her prudence. Let's start with her courage. Esther's courage, Esther 4:11 shows it very clearly. All the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces do know that whosoever, now my students have gotten tired of me asking, what does whosoever mean? Or what does all mean? Or, those are simple questions. Whosoever means every single person. There's not one person who is accepted. Every single person includes Esther. All the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces do know that whosoever, even Esther, whether man or woman, shall come unto the king into the inner court who is not called, there is one law of his to put him to death, except such to whom the king shall hold out the golden scepter, that he may live. She says, but I have not been called to come in unto the king these 30 days. Why isn't he calling for Esther? Has she done something to offend him? Is there some reason why she should be concerned at this time? She's not been called to the king in 30 days. She's taking her life into her own hands, but she's willing to do so. Could have been a death sentence. But she is courageous enough to do anything it will take to save the people whom she loves. So she sent this message to Mordecai, Esther 4:16. Go, gather together all the Jews that are present in Shushan, and fast. Again, we mentioned she probably was praying very fervently, and they would have been as well. Ye for me, and neither eat nor drink 3 days, night or day. I also and my maidens will fast likewise, and so is an adverb of manner. In this manner will I go into the king, which is not according to the law. In other words, I've not been bidden. And if I perish, I perish. If you've been watching the news, you've seen some brave people. And they have the attitude right now, if we die, we die. That was her attitude. If I die, I die. Her courage was well-founded, Esther 5:2. And it was so when the king saw Esther the queen standing in the court that she obtained favor in his sight. So he held out that golden scepter. Christians, we must always be willing to forsake anything which it may take to stand for God and for His people. She was beautiful. That was combined with her courage. Esther 2:7 speaks about her being fair and beautiful. But like Vashti, she wasn't just fair on the outside. She was fair and beautiful on the inside. She appreciated her cousin who had reared her. She demonstrated that in her obedience, Esther 2:10, Esther 2:20. She demonstrated that in the love which she reciprocated, Esther 4:4. She demonstrated that ultimately in her revealing the tie that she had with Mordecai, Esther 4:4. She did that, Esther 8:1 and 2. She loved her people, and so when she was offered half the kingdom, what she asked for wasn't half the kingdom, but it was the protection of the people, Esther 7:2 through 4. She showed her love and her dedication to Mordecai, to the Jews, and I would suggest, even though he's not mentioned in the book, she showed her dedication to God because of her inner beauty. And so Christians, we need to demonstrate through our inward beauty our concern for our God, our concern for the lost, and so forth. That leads us to the third aspect of her valiance. She was prudent. Prudence is wisdom being applied to action. In Esther chapter 7, verses 2, 4, and 6, and Esther chapter 8, verses 3 through 6, not only did Esther know what needed to be said, but she knew when and how to say it. And Esther spake yet again before the king, and fell down at his feet, and besought him with tears to put away the mischief of Haman the Agagite, and his device that he had devised against the Jews. So we continue reading through that text. We see that she had wisdom, and she knew how to act upon it. You and I have truth. We have the wisdom of God. In 1 Kings 10, we see that the queen of the south came to Solomon to ask him hard questions. When you and I demonstrate our appreciation of the truth, people are going to ask us hard questions. We need to be applying what we know, not only to be able to answer those people, but we need to be applying so that they can see us living what we are proclaiming. She was courageous, she was beautiful, she was prudent, she was indeed valiant. So this evening we've had an opportunity to look a little bit at the history of the book of Esther. So we've considered the events of the book. We've looked at Ahasuerus, the humbled king, Vashti, the modest queen, Mordecai, the motivating cousin, Haman, the arrogant courtier, and we've seen the courage, beauty, and prudence of the valiant Queen Esther. Thank you so much for your kind attention.